right, good morning, everybody. Wanted Bruchim Habayim. Welcome, everybody. Shalom Avracha. I want to talk a little bit about the 3 weeks, which today is the last day before the 9 days starts, even though obviously the 3 weeks includes the 9 days, but this is the last day that's distinct from the 9 days. For those who don't know, I guess I'll get into some basics. We have 3 weeks of mourning for the destruction of the temple that starts on the 17th of Tammuz and ends on the 9th of Av. And that 17th of Tammuz and the 9th of Av, they fall on the same day of the week, and they are fast days. The 17th of Tammuz is more or less a normal fast day, for lack of a better term, although it's the longest of the quote-unquote normal fast days, meaning it's from morning to night. And then Tisha B'Av is from sundown to nightfall the following day, so it's over 24 hours, over 25 hours, depending on your custom. And these reflect the saddest times of the Jewish calendar, particularly the 9th of Av, Tisha B'Av. Fast of Av is the day that is the day of the most mourning. We have a very intense liturgy. It takes, meaning after we say our morning prayers, it takes a long time to say all these various dirges, liturgical poems of mourning, lamentations. At the night we read the Book of Lamentations in the synagogue, and it's a very moving day. But we'll talk about that, God willing, when we get closer to that. I wanted to talk more about the customs of these and the practices that many communities have adopted during these days, and make the distinction between what is obligatory and what is not, because there's a lot of confusion about these days, and I think a lot of people dread them when really they should be looked on as days of opportunity to connect to God. I remember when I was a bacher in yeshiva, I would often venture away from the yeshiva and go nash around by the different rebbes, different tzaddikim, and one who I would go to often was Reb Tzvi Meir Zilberberg Shlita. And Reb Tzvi Meir, he would often talk about how these days are fiery days. Every Shabbos of the 3 weeks we should look forward to the spiritual opportunities that we have during this time to connect to God in a very special way, and not to look on these days with dread as much as to look upon them with hope and with faith and with general spirituality that's connected to the customs of mourning and the ideology of this time of the year. And I think sometimes some of the ways that we approach a lot of these things, we fail to see the forest through the trees. We tend to think that local community practices are somehow halacha, which they really aren't. If one keeps them, tava bracha, a blessing comes upon such a person who keeps these, I wouldn't even call them customs, these practices. But we have to be realistic, and we have to be educated and know what we're talking about, because it just seems that it gets stronger and stronger, and there's really no source for a lot of these things. So first we'll talk about, even though today's the last day of this distinction, the 3 weeks, during this time we see a lot of customs have developed, and there are biblical and rabbinical hints to these ideas, but historically these are not binding. The earliest, there's nothing whatsoever, halachically speaking, in the Talmud about the 3 weeks. Ideologically, we say that in the Bible, in the book of Lamentations, it says, V'sigucha bein ha-mitzarim, that all the sorrows and the troubles reached the Jewish people, bein ha-mitzarim, and it is indeed apt, biblically appropriate to use the term Jewish people for really anything after King Solomon. Once the kingdom split, the lower kingdom were the Jews, were the kingdom of Judah, regardless of whatever tribe one belonged to. I know we talked about that a lot, but I think it's always worthwhile because you hear certain people say, well, Israelite and Jewish and this and that. Biblically, once the kingdom split, it was the southern kingdom, and that was all that was left by the time the temple was destroyed, because the northern kingdom had been taken away a few generations earlier by the Assyrians. So certainly by that point, in the time of Jeremiah, even in the middle of the time of Isaiah, all we had left were the Jews. The northern kingdom was gone and lost. There were members of the other tribes who joined the kingdom of Judea. So there really isn't any real need to go back and say that these lost tribes will somehow be reunited. Although some people believe that, and there's really nothing wrong with believing that either. We'll see what happens in the eschatology. In any event, the Jewish people suffered during these times, and the troubles came between these two times of suffering, the 17th of Tammuz and Tisha B'Av. So that's where we get this idea of the 3 weeks. Later in history, much well after the Talmud, is when we started to have the ideas that it became customary not to cut one's hair during the 3 weeks and not to make weddings during the 3 weeks. The extension of not making weddings, many people have suggested that one should not listen to music at all, and certainly one should not dance. In general, it's been accepted that one should not dance, except maybe on Shabbos, or we don't make weddings. But let's say if a bar mitzvah is made during this time, the custom is to have an a cappella singer as opposed to live music. If there's a bris or a pidyon ben or something like that, and again we can talk about that later as well. We generally don't have live music, but the question of listening to music on the radio or recorded music, there are many different opinions, but a lot of people tend to take the more stricter opinion, and there's really no need to do this, particularly if someone has a strong emotional need, particularly, or if they're driving and people are used to listening to music. When this practice began, it's not even an edict, it's not a halacha, it's not a minhag, it's a practice, it's a hanhaga. When this began, people didn't generally have music, and there are opinions halachically that we should never listen to music, or only at a wedding or so forth, and that's kind of where a lot of these ideas come from. But our society has indeed changed, and since this is not a halachic issue, but rather one, and not even a minhag issue, but an issue of practice, an issue of hanhaga. I know some people say that if you have what's called simcha b'reim, that you have a few people sitting together listening to recorded music, that could be an issue. But if you're driving in your car and you just need something so you can focus on the road or something like that, if you can be strong and not do it, tavei alav bracha. But if it's really an issue, it's probably better to listen to the music than not to. There's no, and certainly during the Sefira, there's no Inyan whatsoever. Again, we don't make weddings and we don't cut hair, but then there's different customs about that, different practices, different communities. But again, it's not halacha. When we come to 9 days there, then we get a little bit stronger, because the Talmud doesn't indeed say Mi shenichnas Av v'matim b'simcha. Once the month of Av begins, we reduce our joy. Or if you want to translate it Exactly, it's we reduce with joy, and so the Hasidic approach is that we, even when we're doing this, we have joy in our heart. That's how we should approach it. In any event, we have this that we're talking about here about the destruction of the temple and the mourning for it. So again, like we said, from the Rosh Chodesh Av, the custom is, the general practice is, particularly among Ashkenazim, is that we don't eat meat from Rosh Chodesh Av, except on Shabbos, until after Tisha B'Av, until the 10th of Av, actually. We don't bathe for pleasure, and obviously the other restrictions apply. We don't do laundry or wear freshly laundered clothes. And again, we don't listen to music, we don't cut our hair. And then we'll talk about Tisha B'Av itself specifically when we in another video, maybe next week. We have to understand what this means. And also there's kind of a superstitious idea that we try to avoid anything that's dangerous. We try to avoid going to court if possible. If we have a court case against a non-Jew, we try to push it off till after the whole month is over, but at least till after Tisha B'Av, better till after Tu B'Av. But again, these are not actual laws, even though they're brought in Shulchan Aruch or Kitzur Shulchan Aruch. These are more advice and practices that are common in certain communities. If you're part of a community, you should follow the practices of your community. However, there are certain things that should be noted. So, if a Sudas mitzvah arises, certainly on Shabbos we eat meat like regular. The whole question about wearing Shabbos clothes on the Shabbos before Tisha B'Av, we'll talk about that probably again next week. But we have, this year Rosh Chodesh Av is Shabbos, so it's a little bit of different type of Tisha B'Av. And one thing we should note is that the Sephardic custom, which is more close to the actual halacha, and even that is above and beyond what is actually required according to the Shulchan Aruch, according to the Gemara, is that only the week in which Tisha B'Av falls do these extra stringencies apply. And even the Ashkenazim recognize that as well, that there's a difference between the 9 days before a Shabbos and the 9 days after the Shabbos before Tisha B'Av. But again, this year Tisha B'Av is Sunday, so there is no Shua Shechal Bo. It's simply it is Sunday, and that's it. And so really there should be no prohibition at all, certainly for Sephardim, but really even for Ashkenazim. We can be lenient when it comes to a lot of things, practically speaking, because it's not there's only the 1 day of Tisha B'Av. That's the week in which Tisha B'Av falls, and there's no Shavua Shechal Bo. There's no week in which Tisha B'Av falls. But when it comes to eating meat, I encourage people to be strict with that. I myself, even if there's a siyum or something, I usually don't eat meat, but I know a lot of from people do, and I know a lot of the tzaddikim encouraged making siyumim. I don't understand this. Why would you go into this lane just to block? I don't know. People do all the time. Just to eat meat, to make a siyum. There's different opinions about that, but I know generally the Satmarav, he would encourage people to make a siyum, but he himself generally would not eat meat. Now I have a son whose birthday is during the 9 days. It happens to be the yahrzeit of the Arizal, which is a common day among Hasidim to make a siyum and to eat meat.